Good morning, children. Today we are going to discuss about the respiratory system. Some more important points about the process of respiration. Right? You know very well the lungs are the light spongy tissue enclosed by thoracic cavity. They're surrounded by the right what you call eight tight space. You know very well thoracic cavity like that we discussed, right? So the thoracic cavity is bound dorsally by vertebral column. Dorsally, what is there for thoracic cavity? Vertebral column. Ventrally by the sternum, laterally by the ribs, and on the lower side by the dome-shaped diaphragm. These all points we discussed. Now, the lungs are covered by pleura. Pleura membrane consists of pleural fluid, which is helpful for the reduce the friction between the lungs while expanding and contracting. That point also we discussed. Today we are going to discuss about characteristic features of respiratory surface. What is the concept? The characteristic features of respiratory surfaces. So surface area must be very large and richly supplied with blood vessels. You know very well that alveoli, so many blood vessels richly supplied with what? Blood vessels. Should be extremely thin and kept moist. Should be extremely thin and kept moist. So thin and kept moist. So first of all, surface area, respiratory surface means you know very well exchange of the gases must and should there. So surface area must be very large and richly supplied with blood vessels and should be extremely thin extremely thin and kept moist. Should be direct contact with the environment. This is important. Should be direct contact with the environment. Should be direct contact with the environment. Next, should be permeable to respiratory gases. The gases should have to be permeable. Okay, respiratory gases, oxygen should have to go in, carbon dioxide should go out. Okay, steps involved in the respiration are, what are the steps in the respiration? First, you know very well the exchange of air between the atmosphere and the lungs. Next, the exchange of O2 and carbon dioxide between the, what is called? Very important. So, this is important between the lungs and the blood. Lungs and the blood. The exchange of O2 and carbon dioxide between the lungs and blood. The transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide by the blood. The transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide by the blood. Next, exchange of gases between the blood and cells. Exchange of gases between the blood and the cells. Next, uptake of O2 by the cells. Uptake of O2 by the cells by various activities and the release of carbon dioxide. These all are we should have to remember. First one what? So the exchange steps involved in the respiration. First we are going to discuss in the steps involved in the which one? Respiration. Okay. Number one, the exchange of air. The exchange of air between the atmosphere and the lungs. You know very well the atmospheric air will enter into the lungs and the lungs carbon dioxide will enter into the atmosphere. So what we call that process? That is only called ventilation. So the exchange of air between the atmosphere and the lungs, that is the first point. The exchange of O2 and the carbon dioxide between the lungs and blood. First, the exchange of air between the atmosphere and the lungs. Next, the exchange of O2 and carbon dioxide between the lungs and blood. Next, transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide by the blood. This point you should have to remember. Transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide by the blood. Next, exchange of gases between the blood and cells. Next, uptake of oxygen by the cells for the various activities and the release of carbon dioxide. So oxygen will be uptaken and the carbon dioxide will be released. So these many steps involved in the which one? The steps involved in the respiration. This point you should have to remember. Steps involved in the respiration are the exchange of air between the atmosphere and the lungs. First point. Next, the exchange of O2. The exchange of O2 and carbon dioxide between the lungs and blood. Between the lungs and blood. First, atmosphere to lungs. After reaching the lungs, between the lungs, oxygen, carbon dioxide between lungs and blood. Oxygen will go to the blood. From blood, carbon dioxide will come out to lungs. Next, transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide blood by blood. So oxygen will be transport and carbon dioxide also will be transport, and exchange of gases between the blood cells. So blood cells, oxygen will go inside, carbon dioxide will come out. Then uptake of oxygen will be there, that cells for various activities, and the release of carbon dioxide. Cells will be takes oxygen and they releases the carbon dioxide. So these many steps are there in the respiration. Next, mechanism of breathing. So what is the breathing? This is the point you should have to remember. The movement of air between the atmosphere and the lungs is known as the movements of the, what is called, the mechanism of breathing. The movements of the air between the atmosphere and the lungs. Air between the atmosphere and lungs is called ventilation or breathing. The movement of air between the, what is called, atmosphere and the lungs is known as ventilation or breathing. Ventilation or breathing. So inspiration and expiration. What is the breathing involves two steps, two phases of breathing, the inspiration and the expiration. Inspiration means, you know very well, the taking of air from atmosphere to lungs. Expiration means that alveolar air, okay, from lungs to it will be go to outside. Expiration means what? You know very well, the atmosphere, the alveolar air diffuse out of the lungs, diffuse out of the lungs. So lungs to outside. So inspiration, expiration. So mechanism of breathing mainly involved in the two steps, inspiration and expiration. First, what is breathing or ventilation? That is important. The air from lungs to atmosphere, from atmosphere to lungs, they should have to move. That is only called respiration, taking oxygen, releasing of carbon dioxide. That process is only called breathing, okay, or ventilation. Don't confuse what is ventilation. Ventilation and what is called the breathing, both are same. Ventilation and breathing both are same. So what will be the main steps in the breathing or ventilation point? There are two important steps are there. What are the two important steps in the breathing or inspiration, what is called breathing or ventilation? Number one, inspiration and expiration. Inspiration and expiration. What is inspiration? Inspiration means you should have to remember the air will be enter into the lungs. Okay, inspiration means the atmospheric air will be enter into the lungs. Expiration means the alveolar air which is there diffuse out of the lungs. What do you call? Diffuse out from the lungs, that is called expiration, diffuse out from the lungs. So inspiration, expiration, inspiration, expiration. Inspiration taking in, expiration taking out, okay, releasing out. So lungs do not contain any muscles. This is another point. Lungs do not contain muscle fibers, but they expand and contracts by the ribs and diaphragm. So simple. Lungs do not contain muscle fibers, but expand and contracts by the ribs and diaphragm. That is important. You know very well where the ribs are present and diaphragm is present. So ribs and diaphragm, by the help of movements of ribs and diaphragm, the lungs expand and contracts. These points you should have to remember. Diaphragm is a sheet of tissue. Diaphragm is a sheet of tissue which separates the thorax from the abdomen. So what is diaphragm? How can you define the diaphragm? Very, very important. Why? Because diaphragm plays a very important role for the breathing. In the breathing. So diaphragm is a sheet of tissue. What is that? Sheet of tissue which separates the thorax from the abdomen. Which separates the thorax from the abdomen. So that is important. So diaphragm is a sheet of tissue which separates the thorax from the abdomen. Next, the relaxed state diaphragm is, which shape it seems? The relaxed state diaphragm is dome shaped. Dome shaped. Simply we can say the relaxed state of diaphragm is dome shaped. Okay, dome shaped like that, you know very well. Next, the ribs are moved by the intercostal muscles. This is a very important. Intercostal muscles. What is that? Intercostal muscles. What is that? Intercostal muscles are there. These intercostal muscles. Okay. Because of these intercostal muscles only, the ribs are moving. While the ribs are moving, the expiration and what will take place? Inspiration will be takes place. So ribs are moved by the help of which one? Intercostal muscles. Intercostal muscles also there. So these intercostal muscles divide into external intercostal muscles, internal intercostal muscles. External intercostal muscles, internal intercostal muscles found between the ribs, and the diaphragm helps in the creating pressure gradients. So the external and intercostal muscles found between the ribs and the diaphragm helps in the creating process. Pressure gradients. Pressure gradients will be from, very important. These pressure gradients creating a pressure gradients because of this external and internal intercostal muscles found between the ribs, and these muscles and the diaphragm help in the creating pressure gradients. This is another important. Next, inspiration and expiration. This is important. What is inspiration? What is expiration? So inspiration means, what is it? In the lung, the pressure will be decreased. Expiration means the lungs pressure will be increased. So inspiration case, lungs pressure decrease in the sense atmospheric pressure will be more. So that will be enter into the, which one? Air will be enter into the lungs. So this is a very important. How the pressure will be decreased in the lungs? The contraction of diaphragm muscles and external intercostal muscles. Then what will happen? The ribs and sternum will be go upward. The lung cavity will be increase. Then the pressure will be decrease. Air will be go inside. Expiration, lung pressure will be increase. Why? Diaphragm, sternum, intercostal muscles, they all will be come to relaxed position. The pressure will be increase. So inspiration, the pressure will be decrease. Expiration, the pressure will be increase. Decrease and increase. So when the atmospheric pressure is more, then happily air will be enter inside. That's called inspiration, because lung pressure will be less that time. Expiration, lung pressure will be more than the atmospheric air pressure. Then the air will be enter outside. So like this, what will happen in the inspiration? These are the important steps. Contraction of diaphragm muscles and external intercostal muscles, and ribs and sternum will be more upward. Contraction. So that's why the chest, what you call the lung cavity will be increased, pressure will be decreased. Compare with atmospheric air pressure, the lungs pressure will be less. Then air will be enter into the lungs. What about the expiration? The lungs pressure will be more. Why? Because diaphragm, sternum, intercostal muscles will be relaxed. They will come to normal position. So that's why the pressure in the lungs will be more compared with the which one? The expiration. Okay, atmosphere. So that's why the lungs pressure is more in the expiration, and the lung pressure will be less in the inspiration compared with atmospheric pressures. So like this, inspiration and expiration processes will be takes place in the breathing. So what points, important points to discuss? Remember is, first, the surface of respiratory surface should be very large and richly supplied with the blood vessels. That's the first point. Second point, should be extremely thin and kept moist. Third point, should be directly contact with the environment. Fourth point, should be permeable for respiratory gases. Next steps involved in the respiration are the exchange of air between the atmosphere and the lungs. the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and blood. Next, transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide by blood. Then exchange of gases between the blood and cells. Then uptake of the O2 by the cells for various activities and the release of carbon dioxide. Like this, very important steps involved in the respiration. Why? Because each and every cell involved in the respiration. That's why that is called cellular respiration. Okay. Now, mechanism of breathing. What will be there in the mechanism of breathing? The air will exchange from between the lungs and atmosphere. So the ventilation or breathing we will see in the first respiration. What is ventilation and what is breathing? Inspiration and expiration togetherly called. Inspiration also called inhalation. Expiration is also called expiration. The togetherly called, what is called ventilation or also breathing. So inspiration and expiration, okay, means what? Atmosphere air enter into the lungs. Expiration means alveolar air diffuse out from the lungs, that is expiration. So lungs do not contain special muscle fibers, but how they can move in the sense expand and contracts by the ribs and diaphragm. Diaphragm means what? Diaphragm is a very important point. This one, diaphragm is a sheet of tissue which separates from the thorax from the abdomen. Sheet of tissue which separates the thorax from the abdomen. So relaxed state diaphragm is which shaped? Dome shaped. So this is also very important. So abdomen muscles, even the diaphragm and ribs, these all are most important structures which are helpful for the what is called exchange of the gases, nothing but inspiration and expiration. So not only this, what's the mechanism behind the inspiration and expiration in the sense? So ribs are moved by intercostal muscles. The external and internal intercostal muscles found between the ribs and these muscles plus diaphragm helps in the creating pressure gradients, high concentration, low concentration, like that. So what will happen in the inspiration? In inspiration, the lungs pressure will be decreased. Then why the lung pressure will be decreased? Why? Because the thoracic cavity will be increased. Then the space will be more, the pressure will be decreased. Why? How? Means contraction of diaphragm muscles and external intercostal muscles, the ribs and sternum upward, okay, they will go, then automatically the lungs pressure will be decreased. Then expiration, lungs pressure will be increased. Why? The diaphragm and sternum intercostal muscles, all muscles will be relaxed. So automatically when they relax, what will happen? The cavity will be, the chest cavity, the pulmonary cavity will be decrease, then pressure will be increase, then volume decrease in the sense pressure will be increase. Automatically what will happen? The air will be go outside. So that is only called inspiration and expiration. So most important point to remember is the intercostal muscles, external internal intercostal muscles will be contract at the inspiration. The ribs also will be contract in the inspiration, and the thoracic cavity increase or lung cavity, pulmonary cavity increase in the inspiration. The volume will be increase, pressure will be decrease in the inspiration. But expiration, all will become to normal position. All in the sense, the diaphragm, the ribs, the sternum, all will become to relax normal position. Then pressure will be increase in the lungs due to the less pulmonary cavity. Then automatically the air will be expelled out. So these are the main characters and main important mechanisms behind the inspiration and expiration. So what are the bits? What is ventilation? Ventilation is also nothing but breathing. So breathing and ventilation is very important. Next, what are the relaxed state? Diaphragm is which shaped? This is another important. Relaxed state, the diaphragm is which shaped? Dome shaped. So ribs, between the ribs muscles are there. What do you call those muscles? Intercostal muscles. Okay, next. So the uptake of O2 by the cells for various activities is for what? To release the carbon dioxide. Like this, so many points will become in the which one? This kind of concepts. So you should have to remember all points systematically about respiratory surface, about mechanism of breathing, about inspiration, about expiration.